Sometimes you just need to take the slips out and bowl defensively. And you also need to be careful with your computer's defense as well. If you need a VPN, go Nord. NordVPN.com/Kimber to get a 2-year contract with a discount plus 4 extra months and gifts in some markets. It's completely risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. The link is in the show notes. So put in some dot balls and turn them into maidens via NordVPN.com/Kimber. Name and job title, please.
I'm Estelle Vasudevan, and I work for Good Areas with you, and I also do a bit of freelance writing.
I wonder what you were going to say then. I got you on to talk about are we calling it the WPL now? Because I feel like there was a meeting that was had without me and people have now started WPL, but is that, are we just happy with that? Is that just what it is now?
Well, it has to be, no? That's the official name they've given the tournament, so.
But there was WIPL for a while as well that was being talked about, and the Whipple. So it's just we're just going with WPL. It just feels like that's too easy a name for other people to copy. But maybe if they've got the rights to it, I don't know. And good on them if they have. Let's start with the RCB because they won. They probably weren't the best team in this tournament, right?
Yeah, they finished third in the round, right? So didn't perform as well as the other two teams who I think on paper everyone was looking at DC and Mumbai Indians to kind of dominate things. And it did pan out in that way during the group stage. But RCB were a lot better. I mean, I think in the last tournament, their first 5 games, they lost 4 or they lost 3. So they started off on the wrong foot. It was the complete opposite this time around. So they did have that kind of momentum and they could afford to lose a game or two here and there. But I think what was different was that even the games they lost were a lot closer than what we saw in last season.
Yeah, they lost the game by a run. I know they must stole that one from Delhi early on and everything. Bowling options, they seem to have about 9 bowling options in every game.
Yeah, I mean, they have a lot of all-rounders, right? And I think that's just the thing with the women's game right now, right? You have a lot of all-round options. And I think it's particularly true when you're recruiting overseas players because sometimes you have to fill that gap of how you picked your domestic players. So you need to have those options. But then when you actually look at it, I know Elise Perry got wickets and turned out to be one of their, key bowlers in the end, but she hasn't really bowled that much over the last couple of years. Certainly not where you could say that, she's going to bowl 4 overs for you.
And they were, I mean, you just mentioned Elise Perry. It was a very experienced team. I mean, they would have had Heather Knight as well, wouldn't they? So it would have been or apologies to Heather before I say this, but it would have been an incredibly old team. And it's quite an old team when you look at it. It's got to throw back to the old RC. Remember when RCB in the men's competition had the test lineup back when they started? It's got a bit of a throwback to let's just get our old favorite players together.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't want to compare it to the old RCB team because I think I was going through some of the records. Yeah, they had Chandrapal and Dravid opening the batting in some of the games, I think. So not quite at that level, but also a fun fact, they did want to buy Chamari Atapattu to replace Heather Knight. So I think that would have made them even older. But instead went with De Klerk. So older players, but I think also players that are still kind of really performing well. If you look at even the domestic players, they had players like Asha Shobana, who is, I think, 32 or 33, so not the youngest on the circuit. And I know she was expecting to play maybe 1 or 2 seasons of the WPL, but could have a longer stint, right? They are the ones who kind of breathe life into the tournament, to the campaign, I think, because last season was, I think, for the players they got, RCB always goes for the star-studded teams, right? And they did have that star quality, but just couldn't perform. So for that, I think the experience really came through, and you could see that in some of the big games, like the last 3 games that they played. how that experience was helping them. Particularly, I would say players like Perry, even Molyneux and Varam, who may not be that old in age, they've got a lot of experience playing a
Mm.
lot of T20 cricket. They played a lot for Australia as well. So that experience really came through in kind of closing out games, I felt.
And just take me through their scouting. So, I mean, a lot of their players are experienced, but they were also, from what I could see on the hipsters side of things, it felt like they were maybe a little bit more sharp when it came to the players they picked.
Yeah, actually, there are some good pieces on what happened behind the scenes. So Smriti Mandana had been given the task of kind of, given that
Yeah.
freedom to pick the players that she wants and to kind of start building a year ahead. And I think one key player, and it was funny because just before the tournament, they did a little social media video where each captain was asked who the players from the team are, we should look out for. And I was a bit surprised when Mandana said Sophie Molyneux, not because she's not a good player. She's obviously a very good player, smart cricketer, but she's already an established international player. But she hadn't really featured for Australia in the last 2 years, right? So it was interesting that Molyneux's name came up in that video, because a lot of the captains were going for, young domestic players or some of the newcomers in the WPL. But in Molyneux, I think they found someone who is um, a bowler who can bowl in all phases, and she's done that for Australia as well. And then I know they were looking at a good wrist spinner, and they were looking at Alana King as well as Georgia Wareham and Amanda Wellington. And um, if you take the three of them, and I think that's a selection headache for the Australian selectors as well, right? Because all three of them, I think, in terms of bowling, are on par with each other. But Wareham one kind of wins over people because of the way she bats, and that ended up actually making a huge difference to their campaign, because I think it was the eliminator where she hit a last ball six,
Yeah.
and RCB ended up winning by, was it 1 run or 2 runs? So
Yeah, she
just
made
the
like
way they had
18 off
gone about
10. Was
things.
it that game?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Just the way they had, I mean, when you already got Sophie Devine, Elise Perry, Heather Knight in your squad, you tend to think that you've got the batting covered, but they looked for a lot more, I think, little things that maybe some of the other teams that didn't do too well had missed out on.
Let's go on to Delhi. So Delhi probably have the best record in the 2 seasons. I haven't had a look at it, but it's pretty good. You've written, and I'm going to throw you under the bus here. You've written, are they the WPL chokers? That was Estelle Vasudevan _ No. Is it? I mean, it's weird because there's only 5 teams in this, right? And they've been the best team probably throughout the entire, series so far. Even by dumb luck, they should have won a final. Like, it feels like it would be different if you were playing, in a 6 or an 8 team league or a 10 team league. But even over this short period, it does feel like they should have gone through. Do you think they're chokers, or do you just think they had a bad game in the final?
It's an interesting one because, like you said, they've got the best record, right, over the 2 tournaments. They're the team that have made the final directly in both competitions, and fallen short both times. The reason why I mentioned the word chokers is because in both finals they were both low scoring affairs, and they both times they batted first, right? And
Yeah.
here I just felt like after the start they got, some of the shots that were played by that middle order, which is not that inexperienced. I mean, you've got Alice Capsey. I know she's 19 or 20, but she's played plenty of cricket for England. Jemima Rodrigues, you've got Marizan Cap, you've got Jess Jonathan, all in that middle order. And some of those shots that were played, it did really feel like they were panicking when they didn't need to, because, runs on the board is always valuable in a final like this. And, they made it hard for RCB to even chase 113, right? So if they had kind of stuck around, being able to get to that 130 to 140 mark, they would, I think, with their bowling lineup, they would definitely have stood a chance. But just that panic in the middle makes you kind of question, did it get to them? Did that pressure of playing a big final, playing in their home grounds, and despite playing in their home grounds, not having the majority support, did it get to them?
This is the most interesting one. So Annabelle Sutherland was signed for 20 million rupees, so 20 crore, which is about 250,000 US dollars. So well done to her. Not really a factor at all. So what happened? She got in the nets and they thought she wasn't ideal. Was she injured and they never told us? Or what do you think?
Yes, she played, I think, the first couple of games, but then Jess Jonathan came in. She took a 4 wicket haul and she scored like 20 or 30 quick runs at the death. And then I think that's the toss up, right? Do you want a bowler who's had the experience of bowling at all different kinds of competitions, different phases of the game, who's been so successful um, in domestic and international cricket, like Jess Jonathan? Or do you go for a young player who is talented and has great potential? Um, I was actually really interested to see how they would go, because I also thought there might be a conversation whether they leave out Capsy, but Capsy was superb as well. I just think that in the WPL you have so many quality international players that you're going to have a few of them sitting out, and we saw that in a lot of the teams.
Yeah, I kind of also wonder if there is an element of exactly what happened with Cameron Green, which is Cameron Green made a big score against India. He's an all-rounder and everyone knows who he is. And then the draft comes around and he's not in the side. So, of course, everyone overpays for him, despite the fact that he hadn't really done all that much. I know Annabelle has a much better record than Cameron does in limited overs coming in. But it did feel like at the time it was a bit of a reach. Also, as a general rule, bounce bowlers don't do that well in India because the wickets don't bounce all that much. And that's her, like 80% of her bowling skill. It comes from sort of, that side of things. So it did feel to me like it was a bit of a reach. They were we talked about the last team being old. They're quite young, aren't they? That particular side, I don't know, and maybe that's part of bringing someone like Jess Jonathan in, is that they needed someone just a little bit younger to come in, and also Jess Jonathan didn't have a good year the year before, but maybe they needed a little bit more experience, especially maybe that's what showed up in the final.
Yeah, I think that would definitely have been a factor. I think if you look at the Delhi squad, they've got basically every base covered. I think at the auction they had just 3 picks. One of them was Annabelle, so they don't really have too many holes in that team. And if you look at it, they've got some really good young Indian players. They've got Shafali Verma, they've got Jamima Rodriguez, and they've got Minu Mani, who is also done well for at the domestic level. So they've got a lot of those youngsters, but at the same time, like you mentioned, they may have felt like they need that experience in the lower middle order with the bat, because I know they've got a few players, but I don't think a lot of people would have expected Jemima to score as quickly as she did in this tournament. She was fantastic with the bat. And Marizan Cap, who is a, great, but with the bat tends sometimes to be a bit on the slower side, but whereas Jonathan can do a bit of that power hitting in the lower middle order. So all of that may have factored in, but yeah, I think experience, and also they did have good fast bowlers, domestic fast bowlers in their lineup. So they didn't really need another overseas option, I think, to bowl quick.
Mumbai were the favourites coming in. They didn't make the finals. I'm trying to remember, but what happened in the RCB game? Because they played RCB in the qualifying final, didn't they?
Yeah,
I don't
so
know. I
they
watched that,
needed
and I can't remember any of it.
they needed 20 of 18 deliveries with
Of
Amelia
course, it was
Kerr.
that game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With Kerr and Harmanpreet at the crease, and they still lost, which was crazy, just insane. That
Yeah,
when you
20,
talk
20
about,
off 18.
yeah,
And they had two of the best players in the world at the crease set.
mhm, yeah,
I mean,
yeah, and I think that also goes to show the strength of RCB, right? They had their spinners bowling those final 3 overs, and Harmanpreet was dropped in the over she eventually got out in. I don't know whether things would have changed if she was gone the first delivery, but they just weren't able to find the boundaries against the spinners, and that kind of, we talk about bowlers winning you tournaments. I think that really came true for RCB in the last those clutch matches. I mean, the game where they needed to win to make it to the top three, Perry produced a six-wicket haul. And in the eliminator, those spinners really, I mean, 20 of 18, Harmanpreet and Amelia Kerr at the crease, you'd expect them to get it 10 times out of 10, right? But they somehow managed to restrict them.
yeah, no, that was ridiculous. Harmanpreet is back. I saw her. Big fan of her wearing the sunglasses on her head all the way through night games. But she. I don't want to say she's been struggling, but she maybe hasn't been at her absolute best for a little while, right?
Yeah, for certain. I think there have been questions about her form. I think there were some questions coming into this tournament as well, but she seemed to thrive in that environment and produced when she gets going, and we saw that in 2017 in that World Cup. There's nothing you can do, right? There's no way you can stop her because she seems to hit around the wicket. um, isn't really susceptible to any sort of delivery when she gets going, right? And I mean, even looking back at the 2023 T20 World Cup in South Africa, India were well on their way to beating Australia in that semi-final, and then it was a freak run out that kind of changed fortunes again. It was her, right? So when she gets going, there's no stopping her. But those exceptional knocks, I think, were getting very rare. But she did produce one of them in this tournament.
A lot of people complain that I'm not a former cricketer and so that I don't really know the game. Well, you know what they can't claim? That I don't know desks. I've been using desks for years. I'm a collector of desks, old and new, and I'm sitting on a new one right now. I'm the Don Bradman of sitting at desks. So when I tell you that the E7 Pro next generation height adjustable desk from FlexiSpot is legit, this is like Michael Jordan talking to you about sneakers. This desk holds 160 kilograms. It is as stable as anything I've ever seen, and it has under-desk cable management. But really, the main skill here is that this desk rises and falls at the push of a button, and it moves super quick. And it has so many settings that remember your favorite heights. It really does it all. And I could not recommend the E7 Pro from FlexiSpot anymore, even though I am currently sitting on one of FlexiSpot's BS12 Pro multifunctional, adjustable, upgraded fabric ergonomic chairs. My butt and computer have never been happier than when using one of FlexiSpot's products. So get over to their page right now for big savings. And the other thing is the all-rounders. The all-rounders thing is quite interesting in women's cricket because as players get more professional and more athletes come in, all-rounders should naturally sort of disappear. It should be more of a specialist kind of situation. But there's still so many all-rounders at the moment. But I remember, I think it was when we did the World Cup, when me and Sharon did research for the World Cup, when that was, what we noticed is that there's more people who are called all-rounders now, who really their second skill isn't all that important. And so if you scout and your team slightly wrong, so RCB obviously got the mix fairly right, but you could go the other direction quite easily and end up with a bunch of players who aren't quite good enough on either side of the ball, and so you don't get a team. Is that a fair way of looking at Mumbai?
That's a tough question, I think, because if you look at their overseas picks, Natsiva Brunt, Haley Matthews, Amelia Kerr, I think you can call them genuine all-rounders, right?
I think all of them are,
yeah, they can produce match-winning knocks or that match-winning spell. Um, it just, I think Pooja Vastraka is one who didn't quite fire, who is also termed as an all-rounder, didn't have the best of tournaments. And you would expect, since she does play that kind of Hardik Pandya role for India, that she would have been one of the players that they were looking at to make runs and pick up wickets, but that didn't quite pan out. I don't know, it's very difficult to look at Mumbai. I think going into the tournament, when we did the preview, um for the YouTube channel as well, on paper they look like the best team, right? Because
Hmm.
Silverbrand, Haley Matthews, and Kerr are basically two players in one. They can give you anything on any given day, right? But they just, I don't know what happened. They just couldn't produce when they needed to. And I mean, if they had just scored those 20 runs off 18 balls, we probably won't be having this conversation, right?
Also, the other way of looking at it is, and that is a very good way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is sometimes it's about the form. So you can pick the right players. It's
Yeah.
such a short season, right? And so,
Mm.
you only need a handful of games to go. If you're a player, you might play well in 2 or 3 games, but be terrible in a couple of games, and then that's it. There's no way of fighting
Yeah.
back from there. Anyway, you've said they're finished. So, UP Warriors. I
Mhm.
want to. Is this just me? Every time you see the name, and I know what UP is, but every time you see the name, do you just want to say Up Warriors?
Yeah.
Is it just me? Yeah, it just looks like Up Warriors, and I don't know if anyone refers to them as Up Warriors, but it just every time. Anyway, their squad was all over the place. They
Mm.
did make an error in their draft auction process, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think they made really big errors. First one was letting Shabnim Ismail go. I don't know whether that was, the player wanted out because she didn't get to play too many games in the first season. And then when they lost Bell, they replaced her with, sorry, first Shabnim Ismail, they lost Shabnim Ismail and they replaced her with Danny Wyatt in the auction, which to me is a strange choice. I mean, Danny
It's
Wyatt
not
is a
like for
superb
like.
player. Yeah, it's not like for like. And you already have that overseas option in Alyssa Healy, who is a captain, and you're not dropping her, right, as an opener.
Mm.
She's going to open for you in every game. So I thought that was a bit of a strange one. Then it got weirder once Bale pulled out. They picked Chamariata Pattu. Again,
Again,
not like
not like for like.
not at all like for like. Um, I mean, obviously, I'm a huge fan of Atapattu, and I do think she deserved to be amongst those players in the WPL because she's had such a fantastic 2 years. But
But I
that was a
remember
weird
when
decision, right?
the draft happened, and I think it was you, me, and Sham were talking about the
Mm,
draft and about essentially teams had to pick, but we were thinking that teams were picking between her and Wyatt, right? And we could
yeah.
understand why you might go for Wyatt over her.
Mm,
And we still thought that she should be in over one of the squads, but we understood that. To go from that though to one team picking both of
both of them.
them, just none of it made any sense. It's and it does feel like you have a look at some of these other leagues, and I've worked in some of these leagues before where they just pick the most famous players, right? And they don't. I mean, I worked at St. Lucia when we had 5 opening batters, right? Like, those sorts of things where you just sit in there and go, well, how is everyone going to play? Like, what do and you end up with David Warner in the 7th game batting at number 4 and just going, well, this is terrible, right? That's kind of every time I would look up the Warriors, that's kind of what I would see.
Yeah.
It's just like, it just felt like someone said, we need the most famous players. And it's gone pretty much to hell from there.
Yeah, and this, I mean, you've worked with a lot of franchise teams, right? And when you look at a tournament like this, your first job is to kind of sort out your domestic players, right?
Always.
And then you pick overseas players to fill in the gaps where you don't have. So with UP Warriors, they didn't have, like, if you look at the 3 teams we already discussed, they had a lot of players who are playing for India right now, capped players. They had that experience from the domestic players. UP Warriors doesn't really have that. I mean, they have a couple of players here and there, but they didn't really have that. And then to make matters worse, instead of picking overseas players who can fill the gaps that they have, they just, I mean, Atapattu, in a sense, she does offer that all round option. But like you said, just going with Wyatt and then also picking Atapattu was really strange.
It's funny. It's one. I think it's what Chennai got right in the men's competition for so long, right? Which was, if we can get the best local talent together, and then we can find international players who will then give us either flexibility or be advanced role players. That's the best way of doing it. And usually what happens is, I can tell you this for a fact, usually what happens is you have an owner who wants a couple of famous players. So what you do is you try and say to them, okay, who's your dream player? And it's like, my dream player is AB de Villiers. It's great. So you call her in, you try and get AB de Villiers. And then what you do from there is you go, now let me do my job. And you try and go back from there. This feels like the fact that Chamari ended up at this team just feels like, I just want the most famous women. I just want the most famous women. I just want the best players. I just want the biggest names over and over again, rather than anything else. But the bigger mistake isn't the Danny Wyatt Chamari thing. The biggest mistake is actually before that, of not making sure that you have that strong Indian core.
Yeah.
Also, they didn't field very well, which doesn't help either. And it's interesting because they're not one of the teams linked to a franchise, right? A men's franchise. It does feel like they're making a lot of mistakes that early franchises make. And so you talk about the local players, then you talk about what looks like them just going out and getting famous players. The third one is role clarity, of like, you need to make sure you've got players who can do each individual role. I'd be fascinated to have a chat with someone from them and about what they think went wrong. But those seem to be the three main issues. And if you go back through the history of franchise cricket, especially in the men's game, that's what every team did wrong at the start, right? Like, it was just like, we just need sloggers. You do, but this guy needs to bat at number 6, and this guy needs to bat at number 3, and you've got 2 guys who can bat at number 6 and no one who can bat at number 3. It feels like, looking at their squad again, it was a little bit like that. The balance was never right.
Yeah, and what was strange was also that what worked for them in the first season, they finished third. What worked for them, they deviated from that. Like, they had Kiran Navgire and Grace Harris in that middle order at 5, 6, 7. The ones who could close out the games. But in this tournament, they decided to top load completely. I mean, once one of their openers got injured, they promoted Navgire. She did well. And they completely top loaded. They had, I think, Grace Harris batting at 4, Atapattu at 3. So basically, once those top 4 are gone, you're in deep trouble, right? You don't have that middle order or that experience in the middle order to do much. So that part was really disappointing. When you look at, they could have made more of this, more of the tournament, if they had kind of worked with the resources they had in a better way.
And that's another thing that teams do is, and you see this everywhere, of like, if your top 4 is good in a franchise cricket, that probably means that you don't have 5, 6, and 7. So you do need to find a way to make sure that works a little bit better. But let's go to the Gujarat Giants, who are a bit all over the shop in this one. They kind of completely changed what they did in season 1 to season 2 when it comes to backroom staff and everything. Fair to say that didn't work.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure there's a lot of work that went on behind the scenes, but it seemed like they all just turned up one day and decided that they would play this tournament. That's how, I mean, it looked really shambolic. I think even before the tournament started, they were going to be the real underdogs, right? But we've seen in the past in tournaments, you can make that work if you kind of plan things properly. But it did seem like they were a bit lost. I don't know whether that's that truly reflects what went on within the camp, but just the way. Also, they were not willing to kind of change things up. They had Ash Gardner and Phoebe Litchfield, who didn't really make any runs at all. I mean, Ash Gardner, I understand persisting with her because she's a lower middle order bat who can get quick runs, right? But someone like Litchfield,
and she can bowl,
and she can bowl. They just persisted with her even though she was not making runs. And I know she has an incredible record coming into this tournament, but she's a really young player as well, right? And they did have a few players on the bench like Liata who may have made an impact with the ball, particularly because they kind of had a really inexperienced bowling attack. So I don't know, it seemed like they didn't really learn much from the first tournament because they weren't really in the competition maybe from the second game onwards.
I think the other interesting thing for me is that, like, again, in a short tournament like this, form is so important. So I think it's worth saying that they were a bit of a mess and maybe didn't know what they were doing. But if you do have 3 or 4 players, especially
Yeah.
important players who aren't in form, there's nowhere to go in a tournament like this. When's the next mega auction that they might need?
Yeah, I think both them and UP Warriors will be waiting for it because, like I mentioned when we were talking about the Warriors, the local talent is the problem. I'm sure there are a lot of talented players in who they've picked, but they are really lacking that kind of quality, or we haven't seen any of it, right? You've seen the odd player doing well, like someone like Kiran Navgire. I'm sure would have, like, I mean, you look at her score runs, you're saying she should be in the Indian side, but then you look at how she gets out and how rarely she does make runs. It makes you question, right? And those are the things I think they need to be working on once the season is done, building up to the next tournament. I don't know when the next mega auction is. I wonder if there will be a new team as well, because like you said, it is a very short season, and once you kind of
And
lose
it's
out
been
the first
successful
two.
as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
You need more teams already, right? It already looks silly with 5 teams, but you definitely need more, right?
Yeah, you do. But I think you do need a mega auction because with the remaining Indian talent, it'll be tough to make up a competitive sixth team, I feel, because just because of the way Gujarat and UP Warriors have struggled.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. But that is it. That's kind of what the idea is anyway. Like if you're running a franchise, especially in women's cricket, I think at the moment, especially in a league that's going to have 5 or 6 teams, right? Like the best thing you can do is just get as much Indian talent available to
Yeah.
you, because there's always going to be a really talented Australian woman or a South African or Sri Lankan and West Indian and English that is going to be not in that, that people aren't going to pay a fortune to, who is going to do a job within 5% of the people who are getting
Mm.
paid a fortune, right? Then you may not be able to get Jess Jonathan, but there's someone else. You may not be able to get, Georgia Wareham, but there's 4 other leg spinners out there
Yeah.
that you can find. And so it makes a lot more sense, really, when you're putting this together, to go, okay, because every good woman in the world who can play cricket is going to play in this competition.
Mm.
What we have to do now is just make sure that we have the best Indian lineup of anyone, and then if it, and we'll pick the Mike Hussies, the Moeen Alleys, the George Baileys, those sort of not the big name stars, Sam Currans and all those sorts of players. That CSK model still works for many different teams around the world. It's a much better way of doing it. Whereas you look at this and you think to yourself, this is not ideal. But just on the extra teams, I know there's a real worry within India that the domestic quality isn't there. Of course, if you actually get more teams, the domestic quality will rise really quickly anyway, as we saw with Australia. But I would think now that these other IPL men's franchises are sitting there going,
Yeah.
we need to be involved with this. This is too big. It's also just, it extends your season by a month. It extends your social media. It allows you to get to other sponsors that you're not always involved with. Plus, I've said this for ages, women's cricket is the best thing to invest in. And if I was going to invest in anything, it would be in women's cricket in India. That is where the big boom is going to go. So,
Yeah.
have even you been surprised at how I was going to say how impressive, but that's not the phrase I mean. Have even you been surprised at how successful the tournament has been, even after 2 years?
Yeah, I was really surprised to see the passion of the crowds during the tournament. And I think it helped that it was being played, the first part of it was played in Bangalore, they played a couple of games there, and then they moved to Delhi, and they kind of covered the three cities where, it was the franchise teams, Delhi, Mumbai, and RCB, right? The crowd was insane. I think, when Australia hosted that World Cup final and, drew in a crowd of 80 odd thousand, you thought that was like the big moment for women's cricket, right? But I think this tournament might be the one that really sets things
I
off,
agree.
because you've seen support from places that you don't usually see. And I know culturally it's been difficult for a lot of players, I'm sure, of older generations to come up, right, in countries like India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. But now when you see how they're being received, that will automatically, I think, increase participation even more. And that's just going to create a whole different kind of environment for the game to grow.
So the thing that I've been most interested in, so I've covered a couple of women's World Cups, obviously being to, the Women's Big Bash. There's Women's Big Bash and Women's 100. When you go to those tournaments, it's a women's cricket audience, which is great because in some ways it's far more enjoyable. If you ask me what sort of crowd I'd prefer to walk through at any stage, it would be a women's cricket audience than a men's cricket audience, right? It's very different, much more family orientated, quite often younger. Plus, there are actual human females there, in a much higher amount than you get in men's cricket. I think the reason that this is so important is because these are a lot of the people, especially you have a look at the RCB, but I think the same thing happened with Mumbai and with Delhi. These are people who follow the men's and the women's teams. And that doesn't happen as much in international cricket as you would think. In fact, I'd say it's quite rare in international cricket. And I think some of it is a generational thing. These people are, some of these fans are so young, and women's cricket has been good pretty much throughout most of their life, right? That most of those people watching that final are probably younger than Elise Perry's career, right? Like, that's and so to them, Elise Perry is, a rightful god of cricket, right? And that's a whole different situation than what we see with men's cricket and everything else. And I really started to notice a change and it was the younger fans coming through and the way they were younger male fans, the way they were discussing women's cricket at grounds, but also online and everything. And I was like, oh, okay, this is the change. And then you see the fact that, I think we did the video yesterday where it's quite clear that the most important thing was the RCB badge. The least important thing was whether you had a penis or a vagina, right? Yeah. And that's just huge because that is not what men's cricket has been. Like, it hasn't gone over that way. And you and I both know that, like, a lot of the people who supported women's cricket, they didn't even support men's cricket. So there wasn't even a crossover in any way. And it feels, watching this tournament, that the future is the crossover, right? And you see it in the WNBA. Like, a lot of the podcasts I listen to in the NBA now also cover bits of the WNBA, and it's just interchangeable, right? This player's being signed and this player's being signed. It doesn't really matter to them what gender, and they're trying to explain how it's going to work. Yeah. That wasn't the cricket media / fan experience that we had seen before, and now it does feel like that's the next big thing.
Yeah, 100%. I think that, while we don't always like when the women's game is compared to the men's game, or men's players are, brought to the forefront of content when we talk about the women's game, we've seen what a huge impact it can make. I think I read somewhere where some of the fans were asked, why do you support RCB? And most of them said it's because it's Kohli's team. But that doesn't mean that they don't then support the women, right? They support RCB as a franchise, and that was superb to see. I don't think we saw that with Mumbai Indians, or not really with Delhi either.
I didn't notice it as much. No, I agree.
Yeah. Maybe it comes down to the fact that RCB fans are united by the disappointment of never having won a title, right? Like, no, I mean, like, for Mumbai,
no, you're right.
They've won so many that, it's no longer such a big deal. But for RCB, it was extra special because they've um, followed this team through the last 16 years, and then to finally have that moment, and they were received well at the unbox event RCB had as well. They had a guard of honor for the women's team. So I mean, all round they've done a good job, I think.
So what you're really saying here is that RCB being so terrible in men's cricket is actually exactly what women's cricket has always needed.
Maybe it's possible, right?
Thanks for coming on the show. I mean, I say thanks. I forced you on because you worked for me. You didn't have a choice. But thank you for coming on anyway.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks to the kind folks at FlexiSpot for looking after my office and my butt by sending me their E7 Pro desk that save your favorite desk heights at a touch of a button. You don't have to crank anything. This thing just finds the height that you like and you can work. And their BS12 Pro chair that supports my posterior while I'm recording, well, this ad and all my shows. If you need great desks, especially ones that change heights or the best quality chairs, head on over to FlexiSpot today.